Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. That's good. Okay. Shabbat Shalom. Well, there seems to be a light at the end of the tunnel. Most of us have seen them. Those pictures of people being vaccinated. People who include our friends, our family members, our doctors, maybe even some of you who are here today have already received that first shot. For me, talking to my cousin over Zoom the night before she got vaccinated made it feel more real. There may be a path forward out of this pandemic, even if that path is still at least many months long. However, what awaits us at the end may or may not be quite a return to what we had before. And that is particularly true for some groups more than others. In our Parsha too, there is an end in sight to a time of darkness. We, the readers, know that the famine that our characters have been experiencing has a fixed length. 7 years. 7 years of plenty. Okay, great. And we know that, I hope some of you recognize that musical. We know that Joseph has stockpiled plenty of produce to last the Egyptian people through that challenging time. So once Joseph's family has joined him in Egypt, we might expect the story to move on, to skip to the end of the famine and to tell us what happens next. But that's not what happens. Joseph's encounter with his brothers takes place 2 years into the 7, which means that after the reunification, there are 5 more long years to go. And we learn more details about the system that Joseph has set up to redistribute food during that time. Although he had collected the produce during those bountiful years as a forced contribution, he's not distributing it as a handout. Instead, anyone who wants grain comes and buys it. The Egyptians have run out of money to pay for their food. And so Joseph finds another way for them to afford sustenance. First, he accepts livestock as payment. And then when that has run out, he accepts land and the Egyptians themselves. The Egyptians will give Pharaoh their land, and Joseph will give them food. Joseph relocates them throughout Egypt and demands that throughout the future, they will give Pharaoh 1/5 of all of their produce in exchange for the right to be on their homes. Now, this may sound like a low tax rate to some of us, but the Torah makes clear that this is a subsistence farming situation. When the harvest comes, you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be yours as seeds for the field, and as food for you and those in your households, and as nourishment for your children. It seems that once the people have given Pharaoh his share and set aside seeds to plant for the next season, they have just enough to sustain themselves and not much more. By the time the famine ends, Egypt has been transformed into a serfdom. The famine may be over for the land and for the priests and the royals, but for everyone else, their lives have changed forever. They no longer own their property. They live where Pharaoh tells them to live, and they are forever dependent and tied to Pharaoh. It didn't have to be this way. Joseph could have distributed grain for free or in proportion to what people put in before the famine began. He could have charged less to begin with. There's actually a midrash that notices that all the people ran out of money at the same time, and that seems unlikely. So the midrash suggests that maybe Joseph charged according to what they had to make sure that their money would all last the same amount of time. Well, if he could do that, he could have charged them less to begin with, so the money could last 7 years, but he doesn't take that path. he takes a harsher route, the approach that says that if you can't afford something, you can't have it. We might understand how Joseph, someone who had been nearly traumatically murdered by those close to him, and who managed to find his way from the lowest pit to the highest office in the land, might have felt resentful towards people who maybe he saw as having it easy. Nevertheless, his choice destroyed the lives of an entire citizenry, or at least changed them forever. And in fact, a midrash understands the Israelites' slavery as being fair retribution for Joseph enslaving the Egyptian people. Today, too, the crisis that is the coronavirus pandemic may end up having long-term consequences for particular groups within society that last far longer than the virus itself. While many office workers have kept their jobs, some fields have been decimated, and some of the people who have lost their livelihoods were already living on the edge. As many of us learned last week on our Human Rights Shabbat, the pandemic was particularly devastating for people who were already right on the edge of financial stability, who may have lost their jobs due to either illness or vulnerability to illness, or because their jobs were eliminated. Furthermore, many of us are aware that the burden of childcare has fallen disproportionately on women in our country, and many fear that the setbacks for women's equality will take decades to overcome. This pandemic hit hardest the people who were the most vulnerable, and those growing inequalities won't mend themselves. How are we going to deal with these challenges as we move forward? Once vaccines are widespread and herd immunity has kicked in, what can we do to help those whose jobs aren't coming back? What can we do to help those who will remain hungry or homeless or out of work, or all three? There was a terrible story in the paper the other day. Apparently, the distribution of the vaccine in certain hospitals in New York was handled so poorly that individual doctors, nurses, or other healthcare workers started fighting with each other to get the vaccine. The approach was everyone is in it for themselves. Is that how we're going to handle the economic recovery? Are we going to handle it as a Hobbesian struggle among ourselves? Or will we take the approach that we're all in this together? We can find a model for a way forward if we look back to our Parsha. We, the Jewish people, Yehudim, are not descendants of Joseph. We're descendants of a different one of Jacob's sons, Judah. And at the beginning of our Parsha, Judah gives us a way forward to care for one another. The key and opening word of this Parsha is Vayigash, and he approached. The word described what Judah did in order to express his plea before Joseph. It's an unusual word, so the rabbis invest it with much significance. They see it as critical in determining what followed. Had Judah not approached Joseph, none of what we read today would have happened. It was only by approaching and pleading with Joseph that reconciliation was possible. It was only by Judah realizing that he not only had to promise his father, as he had, that he was going to take responsibility for protecting his brother Benjamin, he also had to actually do it, to take responsibility. He had to step up to the plate. He had to be the brother that he should have been years earlier, when the other brothers all ganged up on Joseph and threw him in the pit. That was a key turning point in the story. And it taught, one would think, an important lesson to the brothers, namely that it is only by relating to one another as a family that they could get themselves out of their mess, could they succeed. And in fact, Judah didn't even know that Joseph was family when he first approached him. And yet, because of his openness, his vulnerability, In his approach, he rediscovered his long-lost brother. There's a lesson in here for all of us. As this pandemic is about to conclude, we have an opportunity in front of us, and that is to decide what kind of a society we really are. Are we a society that cares for the most marginal, the most vulnerable among us? That choice lies before us. Do we want to treat others as our nation's serfs? Or do we seek to eliminate involuntary servitude and provide for others as we would wish to be provided for? Can we be a society that treats each other as if we are, in fact, family? These next 6 months and beyond will be critical to answering these questions. Shabbat Shalom.